Hi guys, this is Mrs. Chavez. We're in chapter 32 still, and we're on World War II. We're now looking at the Pacific Theater. This is section 2. So, like Hitler, Japan's military leaders had dreams of having an empire. Japan's expansion had begun in 1931. That year, the Japanese troops took over Manchuria in the northeastern part of China. 6 years later, Japanese armies swept into the heartland of China. They expected a quick victory, but the Chinese resistance was fierce, and that caused the war to drag on. This placed a big strain on Japan's economy. So they were short on resources, and so in order to increase their resources, Japanese leaders were looking towards those European colonies that were rich in resources that as to make them part of their empire. Now, by October of 1940, Americans had cracked one of the codes that the Japanese used in sending secret messages. So they were well aware of the Japanese plans in Southeast Asia. If Japan conquered European colonies there, it could also threaten the American-controlled Philippines and Guam. So to stop the Japanese advance, the U.S. government sent aid to strengthen the Chinese resistance to the Japanese. And when the Japanese overran French Indochina, that's Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, in July of 1941, Roosevelt completely cut off any oil shipments to Japan. Japan had no oil. They have no steel. They needed those shipments. So despite this oil shortage, the Japanese continued to expand their empire. They hoped to catch the European colonial powers in the U.S. by surprise, so they planned massive attacks on British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia and on American outposts in the Pacific. At the same time, Admiral Yamamoto, Japan's greatest naval strategist, also called for an attack on the U.S. fleet in Hawaii. It was, he said, quote, a dagger pointed at Japan's throat and must be stopped. Early in the morning of December 7, 1941, American sailors at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii awoke to the roar of explosives. A Japanese attack was underway. U.S. military leaders had known from the coded Japanese message that an attack might come, but they didn't know when or where it would occur. Within 2 hours, the Japanese had sunk or damaged 19 American ships, including 8 battleships that were moored in Pearl Harbor at the time. More than 2,300 Americans were killed, with over 1,100 wounded. News of the attack stunned the American people. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress. December 7, 1941, he declared was a date in which will live in infamy, and Congress quickly accepted his request for a declaration of war on Japan and its allies. Almost at the same time of the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese launched bombing raids on the British colony of Hong Kong and the American-controlled island of Guam and Wake Island. They also landed an invasion force in Thailand. The Japanese drive for a Pacific empire was definitely underway. Now, lightly defended, Guam and Wake Islands fell quickly to the Japanese forces. The Japanese then turned their attention to the Philippines. In January 1942, they marched into the Philippine capital, Manila. American and Filipino forces took up defensive position on the Bataan Peninsula on the northwestern edge of the Manila Bay. At the same time, the Philippine government moved to the island of Corregidor, just to the south of Bataan. After about 3 months of tough fighting, the Japanese took the Bataan Peninsula in April, and Corregidor fell in the following months. The Japanese also continued their strikes against British possessions in Asia. After seizing Hong Kong, they invaded Malaya from the sea and overland from Thailand. By February 1942, the Japanese had reached Singapore, which was strategically located at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. After fierce fighting, the colony surrendered. Within a month, the Japanese had conquered the resource-rich Dutch East Indies, which we call Indonesia now, including the islands of Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and Celebes. The Japanese also moved westward, taking Burma. From there, they planned to launch a strike against India, the largest of Britain's colonies. By the time Burma fell, Japan had taken control of more than 1 million square miles of Asian land. About 150 million people lived in these vast areas. Now, before these conquests, the Japanese had tried to win the support of Asians with the anti-colonialist idea of East Asia for the Asiatics, meaning the Americans, the British, the Europeans should not be in Asia. It should be only for Asiatics. But after victory, the Japanese quickly made it clear that they had come as conquerors, and they treated the people of their new colonies with extreme cruelty. However, the Japanese reserved the most brutal treatment for Allied prisoners of war. Now, the Japanese considered it dishonorable to surrender, and they had contempt for prisoners of war in their charge. On the Bataan Death March, this was a forced march of more than 50 miles up the peninsula, the Japanese subjected their captives to terrible cruelties. Of the approximately 70,000 prisoners who started the Bataan Death March, only 54,000 survived it. After a string of victories, the Japanese seemed to be unbeatable. Nonetheless, the Allies, mainly Americans and Australians, were anxious to strike back in the Pacific. The U.S. in particular wanted revenge for Pearl Harbor. In April of 1942, 16 B-25 bombers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle bombed Tokyo and several other Japanese cities. Now, the bombings did very little damage, but the raid made an important psychological point to both American and Japanese that Japan was vulnerable. Japan could be defeated. Doolittle's raid on Japan raised American morale and shook the confidence of some of the Japanese citizens. As one citizen said, "We started to doubt that we were invincible." In addition, some Japanese worried that defending and controlling a vast empire caused them to spread their resources too thin. Slowly, the Allies began to turn the tide. Early in May of 1942, an American fleet with Australian support intercepted a Japanese strike force headed for Port Moresby in New Guinea. The city housed a critical Allied air base. Control of the air base would put the Japanese in easy striking distance of Australia. In the battle that followed, the Battle of the Coral, both sides used a new kind of naval warfare. The opposing ships did not fire a single shot. In fact, they often couldn't even see one another. Instead, airplanes taking off from the huge aircraft carriers attacked the ships. The Allies suffered more losses in ships and troops than did the Japanese. However, the Battle of the Coral Sea was something of a victory for the Allies and had stopped Japan's southward advances. Japan next targeted Midway Island, some 1,500 miles west of Hawaii, the location of a key American airfield. Thanks to the Allied codebreakers, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, knew that a huge Japanese force was heading towards Midway. Admiral Yamamoto himself was in command of the Japanese fleet. He hoped that the attack on Midway would draw the whole of the U.S. Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor to defend the island. On June 4th, with American forces hidden beyond the horizon, Nimitz allowed the Japanese to begin their assault on the island. As the first Japanese planes got into the air, American planes swooped in to attack the Japanese fleet. Many Japanese planes were still on the deck of the aircraft carriers. The strategy was a success. American pilots destroyed 332 Japanese planes, all 4 aircraft carriers, and 1 support ship. Yamamoto ordered his crippled fleet to withdraw. By June 7, 1942, the battle was over. The Battle of Midway turned the tide of the war in the Pacific. With morale high after their victory at Midway, the Allies took the offensive. The war in the Pacific involved vast distances. Japanese troops had dug in on hundreds of islands across the Pacific Ocean. General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of the Allied land forces in the Pacific, developed a plan to handle this problem. MacArthur believed that storming each island would be a long and costly effort. Instead, he wanted to island hop past Japanese strongholds. He would then seize islands that were not well defended but were closer to Japan. MacArthur's first target soon presented itself. The U.S. military leaders had learned that the Japanese were building a huge airbase on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The Allies had to strike fast before the base was complete and became another Japanese stronghold. At dawn on August 7, 1942, several thousand U.S. Marines with Australian support landed on Guadalcanal and the neighboring island of Tulagi. The Marines had little trouble seizing Guadalcanal's airfield, but the battle for control of the island turned into a savage struggle as both sides poured in fresh troops. In February 1942, after 6 months of fighting on land and at sea, the Battle of Guadalcanal finally ended. After losing more than 24,000 of a force of 36,000 soldiers, the Japanese abandoned what they came to call the Island of Death. To American war correspondent Ralph Martin and the U.S. soldiers who fought there, Guadalcanal was simply hell. Hell was red, furry spiders as big as your fist, enormous rats and bats everywhere, rivers with wading crocodiles, the sour, foul smell of the squishy jungle, humidity that rotted a body within hours. Hell was an enemy so fanatic that it used its own dead as booby traps. As Japan worked to establish a new order in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the Nazis moved ahead with Hitler's design for a new order in Europe. This design included plans for dealing with those that Hitler considered to be unfit for the Third Reich.